Okay, well, welcome everybody to this latest Leeds Online Zoom talk. We've been doing these now for since about July 2020, so this is about the 30th or 35th meeting we've had, and it's good to see so many of you joining this afternoon. It's interesting in the pre-lecture discussion, everybody is talking about things that theosophists never really used to talk about, which was politics, social issues, finance, and all the other things associated with that. And I think it's quite refreshing that people with an esoteric view of the world are now starting to look on the world and trying to understand from an esoteric perspective why the exoteric, the outward things, are actually happening. And this is what I hope to deal with this afternoon. I'm going to principally try and dwell on something that's not very often discussed and which is quite difficult to discuss, which is the underlying reasons, the esoteric reasons for many of the things which are unfolding on this planet at the moment. There is a version of my talk available on Hermes Risen magazine, and I've put the link to that in the chat box should anybody want to check it out. What I would say, a couple of things just before I begin. Firstly, don't believe anything that I say. Check it for yourself, as with everything, and we can't stress this too strongly. Otherwise we're just propagandists rather than just suggesting ideas. So use your own information and knowledge, and above all, your own intuition, because this is a very powerful faculty that we all have, and which it would do as well to develop as much as we can. The second thing is that there is this term conspiracy theorist, and there are some people who think that as soon as you put an alternative viewpoint forward or depart from the prevailing narrative, then somehow you're a conspiracy theorist. There clearly are many conspiracies in the world, so people who tend just to look at things from a particular perspective, i.e. the mainstream view, are often wrong. If you'd been someone of this bent in the 15th century, as was said earlier on, you would have believed that the earth is flat and that everything revolved around this particular planet. That view was wrong then, but it was enforced by the prevailing authorities. So we're going through quite extraordinary times at the moment. Everybody realizes this, and it's happening on so many different levels, probably focused by COVID-19, which has caused a bigger upheaval than probably any other event, certainly in my lifetime. And it's led to a lot of questioning, and it's actually succeeded in pulling down some of the old order, and it's all very messy. It's all very messy because we don't know who to believe anymore. There is no central view of what's happening. Some people describe this as a post-truth era, and that may be the case. We live in this age of psychological confusion. I'll be dealing with that in just a moment. So we're going to look at the dark forces and try and identify what we mean by these dark forces, and trying to analyze to some degree how, and more importantly, perhaps why they operate in the way that they do. But they work basically on human negativities. They work on power, control and greed, glamour, fame, prestige, anger, and above all, they operate on the level of fear. And we're living in an age of fear at the moment. And those fears are many and varied. When is Russia going to invade Ukraine? When is the ecosystem going to collapse, etc., etc., etc.? There's a long, long litany of fears which sweep through our lives and shape our mental landscape, and above all, our behavior as well. Anyway, these dark forces are nothing new. They've existed since remotest antiquity, and they've always had a disruptive and negative impact on much of human activity. So there are malign energies and evil entities who employ them. And the problem is that these entities continually shapeshift to suit the needs of the time that they wish to influence. They operate, as we'll explain in a few minutes, behind the scenes, secretly, covertly, but also they operate clearly, as we've been discussing before this meeting, in plain sight. But their mission is always essentially the same one. And it's a mysterious mission, and perhaps from our standpoint, an incoherent one. It's to impede humanity's spiritual unfoldment and hamper humanity's evolutionary potential. We'll speculate later as to why they might want to do this. I'm currently engaged in my own personal battles against certain dark forces, and I'm not going to elaborate any more than that. But this is why I've become very interested in this particular topic. And I think it's crucially important at this time that we try and get beneath the surface and look at what might be happening underneath that particular surface. And this is what I'm going to attempt to do. So, who are the dark forces? What form do they take in the modern world? How and where do they operate? And this is an important question. Can they be opposed, and can they be ultimately defeated? Well, let's start with the concealed occult underpinnings of the dark forces before dealing with the outward stuff. In esoteric circles, we often talk about these dark forces, and we usually talk about it in quite a vague and often quite incoherent manner. We don't really identify what they are. But we know that they're busy manipulating and undermining humanity's push for progress and stopping its ultimate liberation from the shackles of the material world which we live in. Many people in the world, the majority of people in the world, of course, believe that the material world is the only reality. There's nothing beyond that. So, for reasons which are quite obscure and often extremely difficult to understand, these forces use their immense power, and it is immense, to impose a kind of spiritual paralysis on humanity and stop it progressing from a purely material world into more rarefied realms. In the wider world, in the outer world, there's also plenty of evidence of a vast spectrum of evil enterprises of all kinds, shadowy plots and concealed power-grabbing elites who operate in secretive ways, and they have even more sinister and secretive agendas, it would appear. And we'll deal with this in some detail later on. In the last few weeks, a new word has appeared in the English language, and it's been applied as part of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is Wetiko, W-E-T-I-K-O. It's actually quite an old word, and it's derived from one of the Native American languages, where it denotes someone who is entirely unconcerned with the well-being of others, someone who is essentially purely selfish. And during this pandemic, and in recent times, it's come to signify a kind of mind parasite or a virus of selfishness. It's effectively a kind of a collective madness, a collective pathology of one sort or another. And what it essentially means is that we as human beings, most of us, just don't know who we are. We have an identity crisis. We don't realize our true identity. And it's for this reason that we often allow other people to formulate and dictate our sense of self and our worldview. And it's quite clear that the world has become infected with this virus and with many other similar pathologies. This virus has also had a very polarizing effect on humanity. It's forced it into various different opposite camps. But let's not forget that whatever happens out here on the material planes of existence doesn't begin here. It starts on the inner planes. And we need to say what we mean by that. We're talking about two planes in particular, the astral plane and the lower mental plane. The astral plane is a more rarefied version of reality, and it's where much of the physical stuff is actually formulated. It's where the blueprint exists for it. Everything in the material world has its counterpart in the astral world. The lower mental plane is that part of our mind which deals with everyday mundane matters. It's not the part of our mind, the higher mind, which philosophizes and conceptualizes. It just deals with the everyday stuff. So all these things, all these dark forces have their origins on these inner planes. And this is where everything is conceived and concocted before it manifests on the physical. So whatever we see in the outward world, we know that its origins lie somewhere else in these largely hidden realms. And this is why it's so important to understand that the causes of all things originate on these inner planes, not in the outward world. I can't stress this too much. So when we observe what's going on around us in the outward world, we should see that these are effects and not causes. The causes lie elsewhere. So outwardly, humanity has been waging a kind of war with itself for many millennia. And there's also been this inner perma-conflict going on the non-material planes. And this is not just about the usual reasons for conflict, the conquest of nations, the acquisition of resources, territories, or conquering peoples. The invisible war is a metaphysical war in which the dark force's wider esoteric purpose is to undermine evolution on this planet, especially of humanity. So essentially, if you put it very crudely, this is a bitter conflict between the forces of good and evil, between the forces of light and darkness. And it began tens of millions of years ago, tens of millennia ago, rather. And this was during a previous development phase of humanity, which is known in esoteric circles as the fourth root race. And these were the people who were the inhabitants of the lost continent of Atlantis. Now, most non-esoteric people regard Atlantis as usually a colorful and fairly fanciful myth. But there's considerable evidence of its existence. Not much has been found physically so. Well, there is evidence. But one day it will be accepted as being a distinct part of the evolution of this earth, as will its predecessor, the continent of Lemuria, which filled large parts of the Pacific, and that was the third development phase of humanity. Now, originally, Atlantis is said to have been a single large landmass, which incorporated parts of the Americas, Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. There were even bits which were said to extend as far as southern Britain. Now, its first phase of destruction from a single landmass began round about 750,000 years ago, when it began to fragment into smaller parts and islands. There was a further major upheaval round about 250,000 years ago, when the already fragmented continent was further broken apart into smaller islands, and this process continued until finally there were 2 islands and then just a single island, which is commonly known as Posidonis. And this is the one that the Greek philosopher Plato writes about in the Timaeus and the Critias, where he talks about the island of Atlantis sinking in a single night. So this destruction took place over a vast period of time, very prolonged period of time, involving thousands of generations. And the Atlanteans themselves went through a number of evolutions as they went through 7 sub-races during that time. And prior to this final cataclysm, many Atlanteans had already emigrated to other parts of the world, to the Americas, to Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. And they may have held the underpinnings of many of those cultures which we saw in ancient India, Egypt, and the Middle East, and elsewhere. They may have imported these ideas with them. Now, many of the accounts that you read, and some of it is clearly speculative rather than real, but the general impression that you get is that that Atlantis became a very wealthy and indeed sophisticated society with very, very advanced scientific knowledge, military prowess, and technologies possibly which were far in advance of anything that we've achieved today. But as human beings often do, they began to arrogantly misuse some of these technologies and ideas. In fact, it strikes me often that there are clear parallels, possibly, between what was happening in Atlantis during those times and what's happening in the world today. Because we have this obsession with science, which is almost like a new religion, technology, and materialism. And we have developed modern versions of black magic. Just the way the Atlanteans used it, we are also starting to do that. So put quite simply, the Atlanteans split into 2 distinct groups over time. And these 2 groups had entirely opposite aims. The bad ones, the Lords of the Dark Face or the Brothers of the Shadow, they go by numerous different names. These were the people who worshipped the technology and they reveled in materialism, and they tried to subvert nature's forces for selfish purposes by using various forms of black magic. And these followed what's known as the evil or the left-hand path of magic. The other group, the good guys, if you like, were known as the Lords of the Shining Face, and they followed the right-hand path of white or beneficent magic. And they viewed human beings, rightly, as principally spiritual rather than material beings. I think it might be useful at this point just to explain the key differences between black and white magic, because people are not always clear about this. Black magic ceremonies, as carried out today and throughout history, basically involve the creation of powerful thought forms and sometimes other entities such as elemental spirits to carry out the magician's wishes. This is extremely, extremely dangerous stuff. Sometimes these thought forms can linger around for millennia. And black magic is about using ritual and ceremony for selfish, destructive, or evil ends. So any ceremony which is designed to achieve personal profit or recognition or gain, whether it's material or otherwise, is effectively black magic. And Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical movement, wrote extensively about this. So black magic is any kind of ritual or practice which is motivated by selfish desires or which are designed to harm or kill other people. White magic is entirely the opposite. It's creative, it's entirely selfless, it's beneficent, and it's aimed at helping others and furthering human progress. It's never about personal gain, advancement, or prestige, or any of those things. Interestingly, and perhaps somewhat worryingly, some of these thought forms which were created during the dark forces' sinister magical ceremonies during the time of Atlantis they were so strong, so potent, that they're still lingering around today on the astral plane and here in the physical world as well. And they're said to be responsible for many of the ills of the modern world. They may possibly, and I say possibly, underpin many modern diseases, although it's also known esoterically that disease is also a result of individual and collective karma. So it's said that this conflict in Atlantis and the harnessing of nature for evil or material gain precipitated the progressive collapse of Atlantis. This is essentially that the last part of it, certainly when Atlantis sank in around 12,500 years ago. This is replicated in the flood stories of many different religions, and especially in the Christian tradition. And it's where a higher power punishes humanity for being too wicked and for straying off the path. But like many battles, this conflict was never finally or fully resolved. And it's been playing out on the astral plane in one form or another ever since. And thereby, it shaped events and conflicts in the material world. And we can see these all too clearly in the modern era. Now, there are esoteric writers such as Alice Bailey, whom not everybody likes, but some like her a lot. And she predicted that this dominance by the dark forces wasn't going to end anytime soon. But ultimately, she said these forces would be defeated. But the rather sobering news is that the triumph of spirit over matter won't occur until the next major cycle of planetary evolution. Just to remind ourselves, we're currently in the fourth round of this cycle. I won't go into all the minutiae of what a round is. But the dark forces, it won't meet their end until the next cycle, the fifth round, and that's a very long time in the future. I certainly hope that her view is over pessimistic and isn't correct. So just to repeat, these dark forces are dedicated to maintaining the supreme dominance of materialism, and by doing so, ensuring that we as humanity don't achieve any rapid spiritual progress or develop our spiritual potential. And they're adamantly opposed to any world where there's no other reality than the physical. And they've been doing a very effective job in ensuring that all you see is all there is as a worldview on people. So the intensity of the present overt and covert battles might also be a sign of something else, a period of transition, which we're all going through at the moment. Because as we know, we're leaving the age of Pisces, a 2,160-year-long cycle, one of 12 such cycles, which make up the great precessional year of almost 26,000 years. And we're moving into this completely new age, which so many people have heard about and which people speculate on endlessly, the age of Aquarius. No one agrees as to when one age ends and another begins, but clearly most people are in agreement that we are undergoing the transition of one age into another, which is very, very different. The whole atmosphere, the whole purpose of this age is completely at odds with the one that's gone before. So this may also be playing into the conflicts which are erupting around the world. You don't have to look very far, do you, to see that there are countless pockets of highly visible and possibly even concealed corrupt cabals of people in the world, inward-looking political and commercial empires, which are just fueled by self-interest and inbred greed. You don't need me to say these things. These conglomerations are often criminally minded. they consist of control freaks and greed mongers, and they have a deeply corrosive effect on human well-being at all levels. And yet, the irony is, it strikes me sometimes, is that these very malign forces seem immune to corrosion themselves. So often, this situation is not very pretty at all. Many people will be entirely unconscious of the fact that they themselves are influenced or even driven by these dark forces, because these forces are extremely insidious. And as we've said, they can adapt to almost any situation. And this is why a degree of self-knowledge and a desire for spiritual evolution are very valuable assets in deterring them, by identifying them and by opposing them. So these forces, which threaten, frankly, to enslave humanity, appear to have amassed greater potency and power than at any other time I can recall in recent history. And the 20th century was a century full of evil. But I think the potential now is even worse. And they operate, as we say, both overtly and covertly. We might no longer have the jackboots and the swastikas of 1930s Nazi Germany, but we are seeing the re-emergence of a kind of fascism all across the globe. And it's repurposed and fully energized. It doesn't call itself that. And this is why the dark forces are so effective in adapting their methods and means to the times in which we live. The pandemic has clearly played a part in all this, because it's allowed certain governments to behave in unprecedented and authoritarian ways, with assaults on human freedom that we've not really seen for many, many decades and possibly centuries. As people were discussing before this meeting, many people actually like being locked down, and they like the idea that the government controls their lives. And I think this is very, very worrying indeed. And it's why it's so easy for systems like Nazism or Soviet communism or Chinese communism to take root so quickly and so extensively. It's why we must preserve our freedom of thought. It's why this is so essential, because freedom of thought is at the core of our spiritual development. So we see in the modern world a very pervasive use of all sorts of technologies, which we can only describe as black magic. Many of the financial systems of the world seem to be little more than a modern version of alchemy, and all this takes numerous different forms. But it all is disfiguring what we are meant to be. It's delaying our destiny. Few people actually admit or recognize this, but it nevertheless remains a reality. The misuse of technology and the mass control of populations are emerging at the apex of this hierarchy of evil enterprises, and we should be very aware of this. These forces are, as I say, insidious and often invisible, and the purpose is to keep us stuck where we are, and promoting this outright lie that the only realm of reality is the physical, and that spiritual dimensions are just superstitious and primitive myths. Oh yeah, and the other thing they like to promote is the idea that you've only got one life. One life, live it, do whatever you want. There are no consequences. Oh yeah, and the other thing they want us to believe is that the universe is just a giant cosmic accident without either plan or purpose. These are the subtexts of that agenda. So we find ourselves in this weird and elusive and almost asymmetric war that's being waged invisibly against humanity, and visibly too. The battle lines, though, aren't always that clear cut, and it's not always easy to identify who the combatants are, or even judge who's a friend and who's a foe in all this. But then that's the way it's been for a very long time. We can find these malign collectives of people on every single page of human history. And when they are defeated, they just basically regather, rebrand, and re-emerge in new clothes with new plans or updated plans, and often new technologies as well. It seems that they have declared war on the human spirit itself by trying to obliterate anything that's altruistic or noble, or non-material for that matter. I mean, they don't have any recognition of higher values such as truth or beauty. And they are working to subvert an evolutionary plan. So they're the enemies of basically anyone with even the faintest hint of spiritual identity. They don't want you to know who you are, because once you do, you've taken the first step in releasing yourself from their clutches. As I said at the start of this, if you talk about these things in certain circles, you'd be accused of being a conspiracy theorist. Conspiracy has become one of those deeply misleading and loaded terms, and it's often deployed to just besmirch anyone who asks too many of the right questions. It's taken from two Latin words, con and spiri, which means effectively to breathe together. And it's been used in English for the last few centuries to denote or signify a plot or a ploy. Conspiracies are never about anything good. They're always about something evil and sinister and bad. My own view, having spent more than half a century in the journalistic profession and having uncovered quite a few conspiracies, is that there certainly are conspiracies that we know about or suspect, and perhaps numerous ones we don't know about. I mean, yes, Elvis Presley is working in a fish restaurant in Wigan, but not many people know that. But clearly, not everything is a conspiracy. And I don't subscribe to that particular view, but I do think it's always important to question the prevailing reality of the time and ask important questions. This is something the media should do and used to do to some extent, but now it seems to have abandoned that. So not everything that people put forward as a conspiracy is a theory. Some of them are, many of them are not. So let's have a look in the outward world at some of the things that are going on. Many of them you'll be familiar with, and so I'll probably be going over ground that you already know. But we start with governments, for example, and they're an obvious example of where the dark forces might choose to operate. Most governments always try to promote the view that they're independent and autonomous, when in fact the opposite is quite often the case. Because usually concealed from view are a variety of vested interests, which usually pull their strings and issue their orders and compel governments to follow their agendas rather than the agendas of the people. Who these are is open to speculation. The question has been asked very frequently over the last few months. Why have all these governments been acting in exactly the same way? Who is pulling the strings? Who is dictating the authority? And many ideas have been put forward about this. But would it be too cynical to pose the question, how many governments now or in the past have ever really acted in the best interests of the people rather than in the best self-interest of the government? There may have been some. I personally can't think of a single example. You may be able to. But the prime motivation of all governments is to achieve power and then to retain the ability to wield that power at any cost. When we look at the last few years and just how many national leaders have been put on trial for corruption or other similar things, we can look at South Africa, Israel, South Korea, Italy, and France, just to name a few examples. We'll mention a few other politicians shortly. If you look at some of the politicians in the world today, and I'm not going to particularly name them because it's quite clear who we're referring to, but their behavior is nothing short of bizarre and outlandish often. Are these really the very best people to lead us? I think it's a very mysterious process how these people get into positions of authorities, and I'm not going to speculate on that here today. But their routes to office are mysterious and often extremely suspicious. Since the pandemic struck, how many governments around the world seem to be observing those 4 vital freedoms which were outlined by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in January 1941, just a few months before America came into the war. These 4 freedoms are freedom of speech, freedom to worship in one's own way, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Freedom from fear especially is something which is absent in the world today. It seems that fear is very, very controlling and dominant vital force sweeping around the world today. And fear is contagious. Fear is very effective for that reason. We've talked a little bit about science, but it strikes me often that science seems to be largely devoid of any kind of morality. At best, it's amoral, but often it seems to behave without any kind of morality whatsoever. Whether it's ever entertained ethical considerations is a moot point that I'm not qualified to answer, but it puts out all these new cutting-edge technologies without a single thought often as to how these technologies will become exploited or commercialized or weaponized or used as tools of control and exploitation. Science tends to see its work as an end in itself without any consideration of the motive or how particular developments will be deployed in the wider world. So I think science needs a conscience more than it has at the moment. We've seen the remorseless rise of technology and technocrats as well. These are the people who love to manipulate technology and manipulate people via technology. And this poses a huge threat to humanity. You don't need me to say this. And there are deeply worrying agendas like transhumanism, putting chips into people. Elon Musk, I think, is developing some sort of brain transplant at the moment, or brain implant more accurately. And, you know, I'm not a techno junkie by any means, and I really am deeply worried by many of these things. Perhaps I'm rather old-fashioned, I don't know. The world is full of surveillance and spying and control, and there are numerous intelligence, security, and spy organizations around the world who do incredibly devious things to monitor us and each other and virtually everything else that moves on the planet. Virtually every nation on Earth has some kind of surveillance or security apparatus for these means. The CIA has become a byword for dodgy dealings, hasn't it? Black ops, power manipulation, constantly spying, assassination plots, drug deals, regime changes, weapon sales, and then there's all the truly bad stuff as well. So, I mean, the CIA and its counterparts are essentially black magic cabals. That's what they are, and they're cooking up satanic rituals of one kind or another, but they're certainly not alone in this. We have a group of people I call the 0.0001%, you know, the elites, the very rich, the mega wealthy beneficiaries of a world which is essentially run by a kind of crazy casino economics. These are the sole beneficiaries of globalization. We're certainly not. And this exclusive but slowly expanding club of billionaires and other financial plunderers of one sort or another view wealth not only as power, but it has an almost religious significance for them. It's a kind of holy sacrament. And their methods of achieving wealth are many and varied. Sometimes they're honest and admirable, but very often they're not. And they're not always the most ethical people in the world. So they engage in numerous nefarious activities, manipulate currencies, stock, set up hedge funds and the creation of toxic financial products. And they even manage to commercialize poverty. So sometimes for public relations reasons, we might see these ultra-rich people engage in high-profile but dubious philanthropic or charity enterprises, usually from their private islands somewhere. But these are often not what they seem. If you look at the activities of people like the financier George Soros or Bill Gates or Elon Musk and many others, they seem to have very weird agendas in which the people are nothing but pawns in some sort of techno fantasy which they are cooking up in their own mind. I mean, Bill Gates has this particular fascination with needles and mass vaccination programs. And this, of course, has sparked much speculation, as indeed it should do. Many of these hyper-rich are also involved in all sorts of other shadowy organizations, which also have a global agenda of some kind, a global control agenda of some kind, constantly pushing for more and more rigid surveillance with monitoring via our cards, security cameras, smartphones, satellites, and all the other plethora of technology which they've developed. And there are all these organizations which frequently come up when we talk about these things. The Bilderberg Group, the Tripartite Commission, even the G7. And then, of course, there's the favorite, which many have, which is Klaus Schwab and his World Economic Forum, which seems to have a uniquely bleak and sinister agenda and an almost neo-communist blueprint for humanity. And its publicly stated message, as Gloria said before this talk, you'll own nothing and be happy. In other words, the 0.0001% own everything, and the rest of us are just renters without any property rights, or indeed other freedoms. I mean, you might never heard of the World Economic Forum or Klaus Schwab, but he's essentially a one-man grooming gang whose aim is to indoctrinate would-be leaders with his ideas of a new world order, which is basically code for a global dictatorship of some kind or another. Now, when you look at the people who've been influenced by him, when you look at his devotees, these include Tony Dodgy Dossier Blair, or now Sir Tony Dodgy Dossier Blair, the former French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, one of those convicted of corruption, former European Union chief, Jean-Claude Juncker, the billionaire Richard Branson, the other billionaire Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates. And other people who have been deeply influenced by him are Chelsea Clinton, daughter of Bill and Hillary. And then one of my least favorite politicians, Jacinda Ardern, the rather sour-faced Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's just postponed her own wedding because there are 8 COVID cases in the country. It also includes other deeply inept people like Justin Trudeau of Canada and the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who now, thankfully, has been put out to grass. That's enough of the politics, by the way. There are many other shadowy organizations and secret societies, some of which we've heard about and some of which we haven't. A lot of talk about a group called the Illuminati and other ones such as Mafia, Skull and Bones, Bohemian Grove, and all sorts of other groups of that kind. And many of these have very unsavory intentions as far as we can see. The truth is, secret societies are kind of sexy, aren't they? A lot of people would like to be a member of one if they could, because doing things in secret has, I think, an almost aphrodisiac quality to it sometimes. But even some of the big organizations in the world, which were often set up in the wake of the Second World War, like the World Health Organization, even the United Nations or NATO, and NASA may have very different agendas from those that are publicly stated. They may also be subject to these dark forces and evil entities. The other area where this operates, these forces operate almost in unlimited fashion, is in the area of big business. And just like governments, multinational corporations, often with budgets and finances bigger than some individual countries, are invariably more interested in generating profits for their directors and shareholders than in their employees or customers. And like governments, they do two things extremely well. They lie and they manipulate. So what we have here is what we might call a military, medical, media, industrial complex. And at the moment, the large pharmaceutical giants, Big Pharma, are playing a very big part in this. COVID-19 has been an absolute godsend for them. Strikes me that these large pharmaceutical companies are the really big drug cartels of the world. You know, forget the cocaine smugglers from South America. They're amateurs compared to these people. So corporate greed, where you get wealth by any means, seems to be deeply embedded in the business psyche. When we watch these programs on the television, like Dragon's Den or The Apprentice, it's just all about get as much as you can, as quickly as you can, move on to the next thing. People don't figure in these equations at all as a rule. And like science, business is usually thin on ethics and big on profits. And it doesn't care really how these are attained. It doesn't really care about the cost or the effects of either people or the planet when it's doing its big business. So the thing is that with science and big business, they almost become ends in themselves, and they operate then in this kind of vacuum and become disconnected from the world. We could say much about religions, but I won't. Religions are a force for good. They basically all say the same thing: treat other people as you would wish to be treated. But they have become infected often by very malign forces over the years. You've only got to look at the history of the Catholic Church to see that it's not all bathed in glory, but I'll say no more than that. The final member of our cast here is social media. And here strikes me as being one of the strangest things that's ever happened. We have something that was set up to enable people to communicate and to further human knowledge, and it's just become this horrible battleground. I mean, social media is lethal. It kills people. People are bullied to death. People get manipulated in all sorts of ways. And rather than being about a means of communication, it's actually become a kind of a global scourge, often shaping public opinion and modifying behavior, and actually limiting free speech and the open exchange of views. So it strikes me as being an irony. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, and we could go on all day, coming up with other examples of where this might exist and where the brothers of the shadow might now be operating. Certain individuals, of course, that we've mentioned may belong to one or more of these groups, and this is important to understand, that there are networks within networks. But these forces, to some extent, not exclusively, but to some extent, are able to thrive through humanity's innate sense of conformity and also its deep reluctance to engage in original thinking very often. A lot of people just behave like sheep. They'll do as they're told. And as we've said, many people actually like these restrictions which have been imposed upon them by the virus. And this is why, as we see in relatively recent history, it's possible for a free people to suddenly be suffocated, even entire nation. And this is what happened to Nazi Germany, to Imperial Japan, to Soviet Russia, and to other places as well. And these forces will use war because they know that war can be very, very contagious and very, very attractive to some people at certain times. So these forces use a variety of weapons, as we've explored, but fear is the big one. Also uncertainty, restriction, chaos, and shortages, because these help them to enhance that particular agenda. But they also use restriction as well, restriction of thought, restriction of words, restriction of action. We've never seen such censorious times as we live in at the moment. So just to sum up, the world has nearly always been suffused with one kind of trickery and deception or another. And it's all too easy to assume that it's a very bad place and everything is consumed and dominated by evil. But we shouldn't be pessimistic, because there are frequent acts of mercy, of tolerance, decency, and benevolence. And we see countless cases where the kindness of strangers prevails. It's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to you. So the world, has not completely gone to hell yet. So we'll just end up for a couple of minutes by exploring what, if any, countermeasures we can employ to neutralize these forces. Can we achieve a final victory, or do we have to wait millions of years, as Alice Bailey suggested? Well, the first thing to do is to try and overcome that fear that's thrust upon us by propagandizing politicians and the mainstream media. The media pretend to inform. They no longer do that. They just basically come out with opinions and they try and shape opinion. How many people are actually free from the influences of all these things? The truth is, not very many. But the dark forces have always been able to mesmerize and manipulate feeble-minded and morally weak people to do their bidding. So when you've got an unquestioning army of compliant people, it's always an advantage when trying to undermine humanity. And this is where theosophy comes in useful, because we absolutely believe in freedom of thought. We don't ask anyone to believe anything. So we need to appreciate just how widespread these malign forces are, and we need to resist them in whatever ways we can. The forces are deeply embedded mentally and physically, but they can, I believe, ultimately be dislodged and disrupted. And it doesn't actually take too many people to effect changes. It's often said that it only takes around 3.5% of any country's population to dissent from the mainstream in order to effect change. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But maybe it's even less than that. Some years ago, the Transcendental Movement, which some of you will be aware of, discovered that it took a tiny number of people to affect a particular area. And that was the square root of 1% of the population. So in a town of 20,000 people, you only needed to get a handful meditating and things started to change. Well, in a world of 7.7 billion people, the square root of 1% is 8,500. It's not very many people. And, we do shape the world with our thoughts. I say this very often, but this is absolutely true. So although these forces are difficult to defeat, we can offer a certain degree of opposition with what we have available, especially mentally. So as I say, we shape the world with our thoughts, and the world is a collective mental construct. This is how we can fight it. Each of us is involved in a spiritual war, whether we realize it or whether we don't. And I'm afraid there's no sitting on the fence with this one. There's no gray. You either are with the forces of light or you're not. And there's no other choice. But everyone is free to choose. Thank you so much for listening to me. If there are any comments or questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.